Yeah, it says we're live. Very good. I guess the coffee's still brewing. You have to get up for it later. Ah, right. Well, last week we studied Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. And so I'll start with verses 1 through 4. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." Well, Genesis chapter 10 was a list of how the nations came to be and who they were. Genesis 11 is explaining how that happened, why they all split up. The word Babel means confusion in Hebrew, but the Babylonians claim it means the gate to God or gateway to God. Now, why did these rebels decide to build a tower? Some people suggest that they were fearing another flood and that they thought it would save them if there was a flood. They could just climb up to the top. But you wonder how many people could fit up there on top of a tower. A couple hundred, a couple thousand, wouldn't save everybody. But also, the idea really doesn't work because they built the tower in the bottom of a floodplain. So if you really wanted to save yourself from a flood, you'd build the tower on a hill, where it'd be higher. And also, if you use mud brick, which is what it says they had, the mud brick will dissolve as soon as it gets wet for a long time. So that doesn't work. So they had another reason, and it tells us the reason in verse 4. They believe that this tall tower will make a name for themselves and keep them from scattering over the earth. So they're consciously looking for a way to not do what God wants. God told them to spread over the earth, and they said, "No, we don't want to spread over the earth. We want to stay here in the city." So this is intentional rebellion, and I think this is why their leader is named Nimrod, which means rebel, because he's the chief rebel. They are now their own gods. They decide for themselves what they will do rather than God deciding who and what will do what. So Nimrod was one of the first antichrists, a rebel who was leading the people against the rule of God. Well, the next question is, what did the tower look like? And a lot of people in the Renaissance painted pictures of the Tower of Babel, and it just happens to look like the Tower of Pisa, only it's not leaning. It's straight up. But those kind of towers, like we use these days for lighthouses, couldn't be built back then. They didn't have the technology yet. Rebar and concrete and things like this had not been invented. And so there's no way to put that much weight on a small base. In the ancient world, they had to build a gigantic base and then build sections above it so that the weight spread evenly. So what the Babylonians did was build ziggurats. Now, a ziggurat is basically a pyramid without the smooth walls. The Egyptians, for whatever reason, it's pretty and it's shinier, they used limestone to fill in the gaps of the levels as they went up, thus making it completely smooth. Of course, now the limestone has all been removed or washed away over erosion over the years. But I read to you an eyewitness account of a ziggurat. Herodotus actually saw it when he went and visited Babylon. He was an ancient Greek historian a few hundred years before Christ. And he said that it had a giant foundation with 7 levels built on top. And there's another scholar who says that Babylonians always built 7-step pyramids, and they painted each level a different color of the rainbow. And the top one, the 8th level, was shiny like the sun. Now, some Babylonians claim that this was their gate to God and that this was the original Tower of Babel. Although we kind of doubt that, because in the list given for the cities Nimrod built, Babel is way farther south. The list goes from south to north, and Babel is one of the first ones. So it had to be in southern Mesopotamia, not halfway up toward Nineveh. But anyway, they say that was the original Tower of Babel and that Nimrod was Baal, the god Baal, and that he took Queen Semiramis as his wife, and they produced giants on the earth up on that tower. That was the purpose. And so they sent a woman up there every day just in case the gods wanted to come get her pregnant, make more giants. So that's Babylonian religion. But then we read verses 5 through 9, Genesis 11, 5 through 9. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, "Indeed, the people are one, and they have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from over the face of the whole earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because the Lord there confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over all the face of the earth. Now, liberals say that this shows how primitive God was. God is afraid of us. If we let the people do what they want, they're going to conquer us or something. And so God was afraid and made them scatter. That's just silly. The reason that he changed their languages and didn't want them living there is because what he meant by they can do anything they want is they will do anything they want. In other words, all kinds of sin and wickedness. Most of the big cities in the Bible are viewed negatively. Only Jerusalem is really viewed positively. Whenever you see stuff about Rome or Nineveh or Babylon, what are they? They're wicked. So it's more likely that God is saying the more people are all together, the more they influence each other for the worse. And we just don't want that happening. He wants them to spread, and so this is how he makes them spread. It's also interesting, though, that it was a nonviolent work. You remember God said after the flood, I will no longer destroy the earth like that. Well, he might be tempted to destroy the earth again when the Tower of Babel is being built and all these people are refusing to do what he wants, but he doesn't. He chooses a nonviolent method, which is to change their brains a little bit and make them speak different languages. It's a lot less violent. But we ended with the most interesting thing about the Tower of Babel that happened in Jerusalem about 2,300 years later. We read much of Acts chapter 2. Now in Acts chapter 2, after Jesus had ascended into heaven, there was a giant crowd at the Passover with people from all over the world. And they suddenly heard the apostles speaking in their own languages from their foreign countries. And they were talking about, how is this possible? Maybe they're drunk. Of course, that's not really an answer. If people are drunk, do they suddenly start speaking Romanian? No, they just talk Babel. They weren't talking Babel. Of course, perhaps if you were from Syria and you heard someone speaking Greek, you'd think that was Babel. I don't know. But at any rate, Peter gets up and says, no, they're not drunk. They're filled with the Holy Spirit. It's the beginning of the new covenant that was prophesied in Joel. And at the end of his sermon, Peter adds this in verse 39. For the promise is for you and your children, and to all who are afar off, as many as the Lord our God will call. So the Pentecost, what happened at Pentecost is the exact opposite, or the healing, the beginning at least, of the healing of what happened at the Tower of Babel. After the flood, humans rebel against God, and he scatters them across the earth by confusing their languages. And in Daniel, there was a similar event. In the wicked Babylonian king's palace, a giant ghostly hand writes on the wall, and none of the language guys can interpret it. But Daniel interprets it and says, your kingdom is coming to an end now, and a new empire is taking over. Well, 500 years later, another prophecy of Daniel is fulfilled, that all the old empires are being swept away in a great wind, and a new empire is coming. And the new empire is a rock not made with human hands that fills the whole earth. So when Jesus ascended into heaven, he sent the Holy Spirit with the message of the new covenant, which they all hear in their own languages, and they can take home for their families for salvation. And then Jesus starts sending apostles like Paul and Barnabas out to bring the good news to all these Gentiles. And Gentiles begin joining the kingdom of God. This is the beginning of the reversal of the confusion of languages. Although they still have their own languages, now they all hear the gospel in their language, and they can teach it to their own people. So the Messiah, the seed of the woman, the seed of Shem, reverses the curse of Babel with the blessing promised to the nations. Just as the festival of booths in Judaism, they sacrifice 70 bulls on the altar every year, one for every nation in Genesis 10. Now the Messiah has stopped all the sacrifices and has sacrificed himself to bless the nations. And then when the kingdom is completed at the end of time in the future, we will all return to one language. So I'm going to read again Zephaniah 3, 9 through 13. This is a promise for the new earth after the judgment day. For then I will restore to the peoples a pure language, that they may all call on the name of the Lord and serve him with one accord. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my worshipers, the daughter of my dispersed ones, shall bring my offering. In that day you will not be ashamed for any of your deeds that you transgress against me. For I will take away from your midst those who rejoice in your pride, and you will no longer be haughty in my holy mountain. I will leave in your midst a meek and humble people, and they will trust in the name of the Lord. The remnant of Israel will do no unrighteousness and speak no lies, nor shall a deceitful tongue be found in their mouth. For they will feed their flocks and lie down, and no one shall make them afraid. This is the end. In the end, we will all speak the same language in the new heavens and the new earth. So Genesis is the story of all the disasters that came because of our sin. The Gospels of Jesus, the Messiah, thousands of years later, show that Jesus is the healer and restorer of all those disasters. The Messiah conquers sickness, prejudice, false teaching, demons, and false doctrines. His new kingdom brings truth and humility and love. So now he's sending his people out to all the nations to bring the good news and convert them into his growing flock. And when the time is right, Jesus will conquer the last remnants of evil in humans and demons and purify the universe from sin and put his children all in one planet with one common language forever. So that's really the story of the whole Bible. It begins with sin and ends with glory. Now today will be a very topical lesson because God didn't decide to tell us exactly what he did in forcing all the peoples to scatter. And I believe there was more than just the changing of their languages. The changing of their languages stopped the work and stopped the cooperation of everyone and started moving people apart. But I believe we can make a strong case using inferences and science that God also used major climate change to move people. The websites Answers in Genesis and a number of other sites and creationist books, including this one that's down here, Frozen in Time by Michael Oard, are books about the Ice Age. And we believe that the Ice Age happened right after the flood. So I'm going to try to show that to you. We do have some Bible passages, but they are more inferences. There's no Bible verses that say right after the flood, God sent ice and glaciers. It'd be easier if he did, but he didn't. And we'll talk about why that is. It is dangerous to just do topical things because you can misunderstand evidence. But I'm using a lot of evidence from a number of people. And so we are speculating to a degree as to what exactly happened. But I think we can make a case for it. So let's start. We're just going to use Genesis 11, verses 8 and 9 as the starting point. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. Now twice we are told that the languages caused them to stop building the city. And then from there it says the Lord scattered them over all the planet. I believe that God used more than just the language confusion to scatter them. So let's talk about, again, the global effects of the flood. We spent a lot of time talking about how the flood occurred. We didn't talk so much about what happened after the flood, because that's the Ice Age. Now, in the flood, it was not just rain falling from above. And even if there was a water canopy, it was not just the water canopy. It wouldn't have possibly been thick enough to cover the whole earth in thousands of feet of water. It says that the fountains of the great deep were opened and caused most of the flood. So most of the water came from underground, probably under the oceans, under the earth's crust that cracked open. So we believe that the crust of the earth broke open and undersea volcanoes erupted. This caused huge earthquakes, and it also caused the heat of the water to get hot. It's estimated that with the number of undersea volcanoes going off, perhaps the water temperature went from an average like today. The average temperature of the ocean is 39 degrees. So it's pretty cold. And if you go out and try to swim in Eureka, you need a wetsuit because you're going to be too cold, unless you're just dipping your toes in. But at the time of the flood, the ocean was probably 80 to 100 degrees because of all the underwater volcanoes that had gone off. So it really got hot. And when you have hot water, you get moisture, you get evaporation. Water evaporates like 10 times faster in hot than it does in cold. So what that means is that there's rain coming off the ocean constantly. So that's where a lot of the rain came from. And also there were tsunamis. When the volcanoes go off, it causes basically nuclear explosions under the water and giant waves washing up on the land. So those huge storms caused the Great Flood, and the earthquakes and volcanoes caused the mountains to rise and later for the waters to fall. But oceans don't cool overnight. If you heat a pot of boiling water on your stove and then you put your hand in it 10 minutes after you turn it off, it's still going to be really hot. You're going to burn yourself. It takes a couple hours to cool down. Well, when you got the whole oceans being 80 to 100 degrees, it's going to take several centuries to cool off. And what that means is there is still going to be lots of moisture in the air for the next hundreds of years. Now, Now then you have warm coastlines and warm oceans. Now where does everyone want to live when it's cold in the land and warm at the ocean? Everyone wants to live on the coastline. It's just like today. Now we want to live on the coastline for a couple reasons. One, it's beautiful, nice view. And the other is that the oceans moderate the temperatures. So you don't get too cold and too hot. That's probably why a lot of you live here. It's one of the things I like about being here is it never gets below 30 and it never gets above 80, or very rarely. So that would be a reason for people to want to live at the coastlines. And that's probably where most of them went after the Tower of Babel. So a lot of evaporation's happening and bringing storms. And the winds blow the warm air over the cold land. And what happens when warm, rainy air hits cold continental air? You watch the Weather Channel? What happens when you get a cold front in the north and a warm front in the south? What do you get? You get snow and storms. It's just, and a lot of snow. Nor'easters are the most famous. I lived in Pittsburgh, I believe it was in 93. We had the biggest blizzard we'd ever had, 25 inches of snow in 24 hours. It was a nor'easter. We were buried for 3 days. The snowplows went through and threw all the snow up over the cars. And it took forever to get your cars unburied. That's a nor'easter. But those were happening all over the world because the cold air over the land, when the evaporated land gets water gets pushed into it, turns into rain or snow. And there was a lot of snow. Now, it does seem that God made the weather at least decent for the first decade after the flood, because how do we know that? What happened right after the flood when Noah came out of the ark? He planted vineyards, and he got at least enough grapes to get drunk himself. So in order for grapes to grow, the weather had to be good for a little while. So it seems that God gave him a pause, maybe to fulfill his word. He said, go spread. But instead of spreading, they all went down to the land of Shinar, in between the two rivers, and built cities. That was rebellion. So it's not that the entire earth had such violent weather that no one could ever farm. Obviously, Noah did some farming. But it's probable, though, that that was only the beginning of the ice age, and it would take a while to get started. And in order for there to be an ice age, you have to have snow pile up deeper than it can melt in the summer. Because obviously, if it melts every summer, it doesn't pile up. So that's the trick, is getting that much. And none of the secular models, these people, they claim that there have been hundreds of ice ages over the millions of years. There's no evidence for that. They just assume that because the Earth's been around for billions of years, there must have been ice ages once in a while. But there's no mechanism they can find to do that, to have that much moisture fall and not melt. So it's probable that on the Earth, it was not all cold, and it's not that the whole Earth was an ice ball, not at all. It's probable, we can see the glaciers came down about a third of the way north from Canada into the northern US. They got down maybe as far as St. Louis. So perhaps the top half of the US was covered in glacier. In Europe, the glaciers covered Scandinavia and the Baltics and the northern parts like Netherlands and Belgium and that area. Did not go all the way down below Germany and France and Italy. And then in Russia, the ice age came down into Siberia. So that's where the glaciers went. Now in the south, the glaciers didn't do as much because Antarctica became the glacier thing. That's basically the southern glacier. There did get some glaciers along the mountains in the Andes in the western South America, and possibly parts of Australia or New Zealand or something. But anyway, glaciers were around. So after the flood, we believe, I was trying to tell you how not the whole earth was not bad. In fact, this was peak wonderful period for the Sahara Desert and North Africa. The children of Ham really worked out well because the Sahara Desert was a lush swampland. There were hippos and crocodiles and all that in the desert. Well, of course, it wasn't a desert at the time. But that only lasted for several hundred years. And then when the ice age ended, it got hot and turned into a desert. And all those creatures died. So after the flood, we believe that volcanoes continued to erupt and earthquakes continued to shake along with the storms. Volcanoes put dust and ash in the air, and that leads to what we call a volcanic winter, which is just like what we have now called a nuclear winter. You know, we talk about if there was a nuclear war, all of the ash would fill the atmosphere, and for years and years, we'd never see the sun, and all the plants would die. Well, that's what a volcanic winter does too. And I want to tell you about some of this because I studied this all week. I read a couple of books about this. It's really scary, actually, what God can do with volcanoes. And here's what he has done. The most interesting book I've read in years is called Catastrophe by David Keyes. And his theory came out about 20 years ago, and he makes a great case for it. that in the years 535 and 536, one volcano erupted, and the eruption was so big that it sent the earth into the Dark Ages. And we call it the Dark Ages. There's a reason. Not just because the earth was dark morally, it was dark physically. The most likely culprit was a supervolcano down near Krakatoa. Not Krakatoa itself, but nearby, there is a crater there, or I should call it a caldera, an empty hole under the sea, 25 miles wide. And that volcano probably blasted for weeks, hundreds of billions of tons of dirt and soot into the atmosphere. And we have records from all over the Roman Empire and even South America, the Mayans, that the earth was dark for 2 years. There was no sun. The sun was as bright as a red moon, is what they said. And the skies were always red. In the summer, they'd get snow all over the earth, even in Africa. This led to much of the downfall of the Eastern Roman Empire, and it led to the fall of the Mayans. The reason the Mayans collapsed in around 600 AD is because all their crops died, and that was their thing, was agriculture. So he gives evidence that this eruption changed the earth. And when you see the cut sequoia trees, and you can see the tree rings, there's a spot there where the rings did not grow for decades. And that's the same spot, 535 to 600 AD. There was no sun. The trees couldn't get any light, and they didn't grow. Also, when you do ice cores in glaciers, there are dust and ash levels very, very close together, implying that there were, this is during the Ice Age, not during the volcano I'm talking about now. But anyway, those ash layers show that volcanoes continued to go off. You can find it in the ice. But that same volcanic eruption in 530 AD led to the bubonic plague beginning in the world. And it would come back every few hundred years. But they estimate that it killed 80% of the people in China, the bubonic plague, caused because of famine and drought. And there were famines and droughts all over the world. The survivors in China lived by eating the corpses of the human dead. That's pretty bad. The other interesting thing as far as Bible history goes is how the Jews actually helped the Muslim empire to form. When Muhammad first started, he wasn't that powerful. And he hated the Christians for various reasons, but the Jews hated the Christians even more. Apparently, the Byzantine Empire was rather anti-Semitic, and they would either kill Jews or forcibly baptize them and call them Christians. Well, this so angered the Jews that when Muhammad rose, the Jews joined his army and often rebelled within the Christian provinces to help the Muslims conquer them. That turned out to be a bad idea in the long run. They thought Muhammad was the Messiah. That was a big mistake. So that's the volcanic effects from one volcano in 536 AD. The more recent one was Mount Tambora, which you've probably heard about in April of 1815. They called that the summer without the sun. There were 5 other major eruptions before that, from 1810 to 1814. So when Tambora went off, it finally filled the atmosphere with dust, and there was no sun for a year. And one of the interesting things about that is that the world got so depressed from the lack of sunlight that the famous novels Frankenstein and Dracula were written. If you're living in the dark and the sun never comes out, you get kind of gloomy, you start writing monster books. So just think about that. If the world could be so harmed by volcanic eruptions in 1815 or in 536 AD, how bad would the weather be after a worldwide flood with volcanoes going off all over the world? It'd be a lot worse. It's estimated that the sun probably wasn't seen for many years at a time during the Ice Age. And in the United States, looking in ice, we've found at least 68 different ash levels, meaning that there were at least 68 volcanic eruptions in the world during the Ice Age. That's a lot of volcanoes going off. So let's say that 50 volcanoes erupted during those centuries, and that helped the Ice Age keep going for 700 years. The dust in the air, if you didn't know this, rain actually forms. Rain droplets forms on little bits of dust. So a perfectly clear day with no dust, you don't get much rain. It's when there's slight bits of dust in the air, the water forms around the dust drop and forms droplets and falls. The weather models used by creationists suggest that the polar ice caps started to form in the north and the south by the time of the Tower of Babel. 150 years after the flood, the ice is starting to pile up. And as more ocean water evaporated and turned into ice, the ocean's levels fell 300 feet. And we know that because we find towns around all the continents in the world at 300 feet under the water. That's because when it was warm, they wanted to live right on the coast and go fishing. But once the ice caps started to melt again after the Ice Age, the water came up and they had to abandon their towns. So that's why global warming theorists now are telling you that the sea levels are rising. And that is true. It is true that if enough ice melts, it will cause the sea level to rise. Now, I don't know if they're correct about how fast it's melting or how quick it will rise or how far it will rise. Because, their alarmists are always screaming about something to be afraid of. But it could happen. The sea level could rise. Now, there was no Persian Gulf during the Ice Age. The Persian Gulf is less than 300 feet deep. So that land between Saudi Arabia and Africa was just solid. There was no Persian Gulf there. That was all fertile land, and that's perhaps where the Tower of Babel is, under there somewhere. The other reason, why is the Ice Age important, is it allowed people to travel to the Americas without ships. There would have been no people in the whole continent of America if it hadn't been for the Ice Age. Because after the flood, we know the continents came apart. And right now, there is no way to walk from Russia to America, to Alaska. It can't happen. But during the Ice Age, the water level dropped 300 feet, and there were wide plains of grass. That's where the mammoths lived. Mammoths, elephants, graze. They're grazing animals. And there were hundreds of thousands, perhaps, of those mammoths living on the plains in Siberia. And on that wide plain, people just walked across, and that's how we got our Native Americans, and perhaps some of our South Americans also, children of Ham and Japheth. So that's why the Ice Age is important, one of the big reasons. It is possible that some of the children of Ham settled in eastern South America by ship, because we see that the people in eastern Brazil have a common language and hieroglyph system to the people of West Africa. So it's thought that maybe some of the children of Ham sailed across. It's possible too. But in the last, let's talk about some of the Bible evidences for the Ice Age, or at least inferences. So Job 37, verses 8 through 12. Now, I told you that Job seemed to live around the time of Abraham. So he was early. But this is Elihu talking about storms in Job 37, verses 8 through 12. The beasts go into dens and